Good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Hannah Birdsong, and I am the Office Manager for the Small Business Development Center here in Durango, Colorado. And we are happy to have Emily Tichenor and Jennifer Bassignani here with us today to teach you guys about some policy updates and some support for reopening your business and how that looks for you and your employees. So first, before we hand it off, I want to tell you a little bit about the SBDC. There's 15 of us in the state of Colorado, and we all offer free consulting, some one-on-one confidential consulting, some workshops, and then business courses, normally in person, but pivoting to Zoom. So I'm sure you guys have all gotten familiar with this new format, but we are here to help you during these times and after, and just if you need anything from us, please reach out to us. And then if there are any other workshops that you're hoping to have this summer, please let me know, shoot me an email, and then I will try to put something together. So with that being said, I will pass it off to Emily and Jennifer.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Bassignani, Principal of Essential Operations, and I just wanted to give you the lay of the land before we get started. Emily is going to present for the first part of the webinar. She's going to review the legal aspects of policies and procedures you may want to put in place as you're welcoming back employees and customers. And for those of you who have been working, check in to see if any of these policies should be implemented. After Emily has done her part, I'll talk about communicating with your staff and your team, some ideas on how to implement these new policies and HR best practices. We'd like to hold off on answering questions until the end of the presentation. However, we'll pause between each section to answer any burning questions you may have that might help the whole group have a better understanding of what was discussed. And you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A button you can push, and you can type your questions in there, and Hannah will look through those and she'll help us field those questions. So with that, I'll go ahead and step back and let Emily begin.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. As Jennifer said, these are the topics we'll be covering, so we'll get started talking about social distancing, which is everyone's new favorite buzzword, I think. So as part of the new Safer at Home stage that we are in, employers are required to implement certain social distancing measures as employees are coming back to work. The requirements are set forth in various executive orders and public health orders. Right now, I'm going to focus on orders that are coming from the Colorado state government, but there also might be local orders depending on your county or your city. So you want to make sure that you are paying attention to those. And as you may be aware, the rules are constantly changing. The Safer at Home public health order, I think, has already been updated 3 different times since it came out at the end of April. So pay attention to those changes. Also, employers in some industries may be subject to stricter protocols, restaurants, healthcare employers, but this is just focusing on an overview for all employers. So Executive Order 2044 is the Safer at Home Executive Order. As you all know, we were in the stay-at-home period that really closed down most businesses except for essential businesses. But now we're in the Safer at Home period, which is starting to relax things a little bit. Under this order, Coloradans are still encouraged to stay home as much as possible, and employers should still allow telecommuting as they were under the stay-at-home order. And workplaces that do decide to open must abide by guidelines set forth by a public health order, which we will discuss in a little bit. Also part of the Executive Order 2044, it talked about vulnerable individuals. So vulnerable individuals cannot be required to perform in-person work for any business, even if it's a critical business. So even if you run a grocery store or you work in healthcare, anything that is part of critical and was open during stay-at-home. If you have vulnerable individuals who are employees, they cannot be required to perform in-person work. And then you'll see here the list of how the executive order defines vulnerable individuals. So individuals 65 and older, people with chronic lung disease or moderate to severe asthma. Doesn't define what moderate to severe asthma is. So if that's an issue, you could speak with an employee, get a doctor's note from an employer, serious heart conditions, immunocompromised, pregnant women, and then individuals determined to be high risk by a licensed health care provider. Later we'll talk about monitoring symptoms, and there's sort of a tension here for employers with privacy rights, and we don't want to violate the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you do want to be careful when you're collecting health information from employees that you are keeping it confidential and that you are only requesting information as it relates to these issues so that you have a valid reason for that. Also part of the executive order, it said that all individuals who are sick or test positive for COVID-19 have to stay home, and employers must accommodate workers with childcare responsibilities and workers who live in the same household as a vulnerable person. So that could be a lot of employees, you know, if they're living with their grandma or someone who is sick, that could affect a lot of employees. Employers also have to provide reasonable accommodation, and they may not discriminate against employees who have symptoms of COVID-19 or have been in contact with a known positive case of COVID-19. So if you know that an employee was in contact with a case of COVID-19, you couldn't terminate the employee, things like that. You want to make sure that you're treating all employees the same, and this might come up later, but just in general, across the board, as there's so many moving targets for policies right now, but you do want to make sure that all employees are being treated the same. So if you are requiring some employees to take paid time off for whatever reason, all employees should be required to take time off in that situation. We don't want to expose ourselves to any discrimination claims out of this, because we want to protect our organization, of course. So out of the Safer at Home Executive Order came Public Health Order 2028. This stays in effect until May 26, 2020, unless it is extended, which very well might happen. So under this public health order, all employers have to take all of these steps. So the first one is to deputize a workplace coordinator charged with addressing COVID-19 issues. There's no requirement as far as who it has to be, if it has, or how many people you have to have. There's no necessary requirement to communicate to employees who the workplace coordinator is. I think it's a good idea to let employees know who they should be contacting, who should be the source for them if they have any COVID issues, and to make sure that the organization has a standard response and that all of these requirements are being followed. I think it's helpful to have that workplace coordinator. We're not particularly concerned about liability over employees having, an employee coming and saying, I got coronavirus at work, so I'm suing you for workers' comp or whatever else, because it is so hard to prove where you got coronavirus, because as we know, it spreads very quickly. But I think if there ever was a claim, we do want to make sure that we're taking all of these steps. So deputizing the workplace coordinator is the first step, and I think it's important to communicate that to employees. You want to make sure that you're maintaining a 6-foot separation between employees and discouraging shared spaces. So whether that's the water cooler or the lunchroom, making sure that either they're closed or you put X's on the ground or notes, one employee at a time, whatever you need to do to maintain a 6-foot separation. Also should be cleaning and disinfecting all high-touch areas. I think this goes back to the workplace coordinator. It's helpful to make sure that you have someone who is in charge of making sure that's happening. You can assign that to all employees. So, if you have an employee in the front office and you want to make sure that employee is cleaning and disinfecting the front desk, even though that might not normally be part of the employee's position, you can certainly require employees to be part of that. You don't have to, assign someone specific to be cleaning and disinfecting, although I think it's not a bad idea depending on the size and nature of your organization. You also want to post signage for employees and customers on good hygiene. So maybe in the bathroom, you have, the picture of how to wash your hands appropriately and a reminder to do it for the full necessary length of time, reminders about social distancing, whatever else. There's no requirements on what the signage about good hygiene has to be. So your guess is as good as mine, but I think we can assume hand washing would be included in that. You also want to ensure proper ventilation. What that looks like, of course, will really depend on each employer and what your office space looks like. Maybe that means employees are allowed to open their windows when they normally wouldn't be. That's just going to depend, of course. And then avoid gatherings of more than 10 people. So if you have a waiting room, you might want to close that, or maybe X off chairs and just make sure that no more than 10 people are in there, and make sure you assign an employee to ensure that's being followed. So maybe that is your front desk person to ensure that the waiting room doesn't have more than 10 people. Maybe that is your workplace coordinator for COVID issues to ensure that employees aren't all gathering together. You want to make sure you do meetings, whatever that means for you, to not have more than 10 people. So if that means you're doing Zoom, which I think a lot of people are doing, that of course would satisfy the requirement. Employers also have to implement symptom monitoring protocols, including workplace temperature monitoring, and conduct daily temperature checks and monitor symptoms in employees. I'll show you this. There's a sample form, so when you get the slides, it's through the Colorado Department of Public Health has put together a sample form, which will be on the next slide. And like I mentioned before, when you are monitoring symptoms, you want to make sure that employee health information is being kept confidential. So if you're say you have employees line up before a shift to do temperature checks, I recommend, of course, you want to have people spaced out 6 feet apart to follow social distancing requirements, but then I would space them out more because you want to make sure that no one's overhearing anything else. So say you're doing a temperature check and an employee has a fever of 101, so you're not going to allow the employee to work. Make sure that you're prepared for that, so it doesn't then become obvious that the employee doesn't, has a fever and has a potential health concern. So whoever is monitoring these symptoms and keeping this information, make sure that person is aware of the importance of keeping health information confidential. So this is the sample screening form that the Colorado Department of Public Health put together. There's no requirement that employees use this form. I think it would be helpful if you are using a form to use the one the state set forth. Again, if there ever is an issue of, claims of liability for getting coronavirus in the workplace, we're not really sure what enforcement will look like. It is Colorado law, so violating the law comes with potential penalties. I'm not sure who is going to enforce that or how much they're going to actually be tracking down employers to find these forms. But of course, we want to be prepared if that did happen. So because this is the form that the state put together, I think it's not a bad one to use. So it's pretty straightforward. Also under that public health order, employers are required to eliminate or regularly clean and disinfect items in common spaces. Again, if you want to assign someone to that, I think that's not a bad idea to make sure that all of those things are happening. Coffee makers, vending machines, water cooler, whatever is shared. You also might want to consider closing those areas. You have to require employees to stay home when they're sick, and you want to make sure you're connecting employees to any employee benefits they have. Provide work accommodations to vulnerable individuals. As I mentioned before, vulnerable individuals cannot be required to perform in-person work. If they decide to perform in-person work, that is on them. You don't have to prohibit them from performing that work, but you cannot require them to do that work. And then you also should be providing flexible schedule remote options for certain individuals. You want to encourage remote work whenever possible, encourage breaks to wash hands and use hand sanitizer. You might want to phase your shifts. We'll talk about flexible scheduling here in a little bit, and then provide gear for employees. Other recommendations the public health order has, just special hours for vulnerable individuals. So if you're a store, maybe have senior shopping hours or something like that. Encourage distancing, use of gloves, hand sanitizer, and however you can reduce contact between things, like no-touch trash cans. You should be using those. Employers with over 50 employees in any one location have to also implement additional measures that are set forth here. And you might say, I thought that all employers have to monitor symptoms, and I will say yes. Throughout the public health order, I think some things maybe don't conflict, but don't line up harmoniously as far as who is supposed to do what. So where there is a conflict, I recommend following whatever is the strictest. So if there's ever a concern that you didn't comply with the requirement, if you did the strictest, then you should be good. I think it's not a bad idea for all employers, even if you're under 50, to take these steps. Implementing the screening, we talked about the form that you can use, closing common areas, implementing cleaning, and then again, requiring adherence to the social distancing policies. Employers might want to create policies to communicate all of these expectations. There's no requirement that employers communicate these things, and it is law, so employees have to follow the law. But I think it's not a bad idea to make sure people understand the requirements. You can also discipline employees for not following. So if an employee, decides not to wear protective equipment or is not following social distancing requirements, you can discipline employees because it's a violation of law and policy. But you do want to make sure that any failure to follow the policy is not because of protected class status. So if an employee says they can't wear a mask because of religion or disability, make sure that you're working with the employee to understand the issue so that you're not discriminating against them. Then you can also visit these are some resources to keep track of as things are continually changing. So this is the end of the social distancing policy. I guess we can take any questions. It might be better to save them to the end so we can get through everything because we have a lot of content, but I will take a pause here.
Emily, is there any retaliation or whistleblower policies or anything like that around if an employee hears that one of their coworkers maybe has symptoms but they're not reporting them? What's the best way to maybe handle that?
Sure. There hasn't been any guidance specific to coronavirus policies as far as duties to report if an employee is sick, but I would follow standard procedure. Anytime an employee makes a workplace complaint, you want to make sure that the employee is not retaliated for that. So if an employee does say, hey, I think Bob has coronavirus, that you don't take any adverse action against the employee. It is a little bit trickier, as we were talking about, with the privacy issues because of health. If employees are saying, I think this employee is sick, so you do want to watch out for that and keep information confidential. Good question. So I'm going to go ahead and move on, and then we'll have more time for questions at the end. Now we're going to talk about leave. There are different leaves under various laws. So the Family First Coronavirus Relief Act has paid sick leave as well as emergency family medical leave. And the Colorado Department of Labor has set forth new paid leave requirements. We're not going to go into detail on these because that is a whole presentation in and of itself about all the leave requirements. The Federal Department of Labor has pretty good guidance on them, as well as the Colorado Department of Labor. So the FFCRA is the federal leave that applies to certain employers with less than 500 employees. They may have to give paid sick leave up to 2 weeks, 80 hours for various issues. Again, beyond the scope of this presentation, if there are questions at the end about these policies and we have time, I'm happy to go over those in more detail. Also, as I mentioned, Colorado law requires certain paid sick leave. This one's pretty narrow. They expanded who it applies to. It applies to most organizations. Again, the Colorado Department of Labor has a pretty helpful guidance about who it applies to. There's still some ambiguities, so not totally sure, but it's pretty user-friendly. And then these are the instances in which an employee can take that leave. So it's pretty narrow. You have to have symptoms and either being tested or under quarantine. It's not just, I'm scared to go to work. or even for childcare. If the employer already provides paid sick leave, the employer does not have to provide more under the Colorado law. That's different from the federal law. Under the federal law, you cannot require an employee to use accrued paid time off. But in some instances, you may require employees to use paid time off if they can't work. That is really going to depend on the policy and if an employee is eligible for leave under those laws I mentioned before. You might not be able to require an employee to use paid time off. If you are going to require employees to use paid time off, I recommend that that is communicated in writing to employees. Paid time off is generally considered wages under Colorado law, so anytime we start messing with wages, that kind of, makes me nervous. So just communicate the expectations so employees are not surprised when, their accrued time off bank maybe is deducted. Unpaid leave, some employees might be eligible for unpaid job protected leave under the Family Medical Leave Act, which is not a coronavirus specific law. It applies, the FMLA applies to employers over 50, a lot of requirements about how long the employee worked, different things, and it only is for the employee's serious health condition or of a close family member, so it's pretty narrow. I could see it coming up, if an employee gets coronavirus and is on a ventilator for a long time and can't work, I could see this potentially coming in, but it's not, probably not for most employees, would not apply. Employers could also provide unpaid leave for other reasons. For example, we're seeing employers requiring quarantine periods if an employee decides to travel on the weekend. They say, I want to go over to Utah for whatever reason, and the employer says, well, now you need to quarantine because I don't want you bringing coronavirus into our workplace. You can require quarantine periods that are unpaid, again, assuming that none of the required leaves apply. So that was real quick on leaves. So are there any questions, quick questions about leaves? Okay, I'm going to move on to flexible scheduling. So employers may want to start implementing flexible scheduling so that they can maybe stagger work shifts so you don't have as many people in the workplace at a time, or maybe so that employees can provide childcare, different reasons. So it might be something that employers are dealing with for the first time right now. So we have Jeff here, who normally works 40 hours a week, but he asks if he can work 4 10-hour days rather than 5 8-hour days, just to concentrate his work time. His employer agrees, but one Friday he needs to give a presentation to the biggest client. He says he won't be there because he's off on Fridays during the pandemic. Can the employer require him to give the presentation on Friday? Yes, generally the employer can. So employers should implement a policy to communicate to employees expectation, and the policy should state that the employer can change the working hours at any time. You do want to make sure that as you're changing employees' hours, you want to make sure that you're not running afoul of reasonable accommodation requirements. So as we talked about, with vulnerable individuals or with childcare requirements, make sure that you're not violating applicable law. Maybe it is a reason, maybe he needs to take care of his child, and it is a reasonable accommodation to ask if he can ask the client if it's okay to give the presentation on Thursday. So while you can require employees to work, you want to make sure that you're not violating any other law in doing that. You also want to make sure that you're requiring breaks and meal periods under Colorado law, so giving that 10-minute paid period in the middle of each 4-hour work period, and then the meal period at the end of each 5-hour period. Even if, the flexible schedule, an employee might be working from 7 p.m. to midnight, which doesn't maybe have a meal period during those hours, dinner might have already happened, they should still get the breaks. You might want to set core hours for flexible schedule employees, so you might need everyone to be available at a certain time for meetings, so you can set those. And you also might want to set restrictions on what hours employees cannot work, so maybe you want to say you can't work in the middle of the night because no one's available or for whatever reason. You also might want to limit the amount of times that an employee can change the employee's schedule. This is a little bit different here. We probably do want to be more accommodating and allow employees to change more often than you would in a normal situation. But if you decide, oh, flexible scheduling works for us and want to move in past the pandemic period using flexible scheduling, you might want to say, you know, you can change once a month, once a season, however much, so that employees are not, you know, calling you each morning saying, here's the hours I'm working today. Just make sure that expectations are clear about that. And you do want to make sure that non-exempt employees are recording all time worked, and we'll talk about wage issues here in a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and keep moving to telecommuting just for the interest of time, because we have a lot of information, but we should have time for questions at the end still. If you are telecommuting, a lot of employers might be using telecommuting for the first time. I recommend that you establish a telecommuting agreement for employees who are working remotely. That would address certain topics like tracking time, which, as I mentioned, pay is a concern, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Work location, where the employee is going to work, any requirements for coming into the office, security of employer information, expenses, so who's going to pay for the internet service, who's going to pay for office supplies, things like that, and then give the employer a right to revoke the agreement. Again, because Colorado law requires employers to allow employees to telecommute, in certain instances, the employer might not have the ability to revoke, so that could look a little different in this time. You also want to make sure you're checking insurance, so workers' compensation. What if an employee gets hurt at home? Does workers' comp cover that? Your general liability insurance, if, say, something happens, an employee is getting a work delivery and the delivery driver slips and falls at the employee's home, who is liable for that injury. You also want to have the employee check homeowners insurance, so if the employee gets hurt at home, does homeowners insurance cover that? Does the employee's lease allow for working at home? Different things to consider. And if you have equipment insurance, make sure that that applies to your equipment being used outside of the traditional office space. You also want to make sure that employees have a designated space. You probably want to get the address of that. You want to reserve the right to inspect that workplace, and you might want to receive pictures, floor plan, etc. This could look a little bit different during the pandemic because everyone's kind of impromptu working from home. You want to make sure that you're not penalizing employees if, you know, they maybe don't have an extra bedroom or something to use as an office, to be flexible with that. But you probably want to make sure, say, your employee is not working on the couch, and that they do have a table or, you know, some kind of designated space. You want employees to affirm that the workspace is free from hazards and background noises. And then if the telecommuting is long-term, you might want to have employees affirm that the workspace is used only for the work of the employer. Again, we probably want to be a little bit more flexible with employees during this time. So if they're using their kitchen table, that probably is fine. But if you decide to have a place say, well, telecommuting is working, let's do this longer, you might want to say you need to have a designated office or workspace that's only for work. So also one thing you want to make sure is that you're keeping private information safe. So we have Fred, who's working from home 1 day a week for a doctor's office. He leaves his computer screen open, and his son's friend sees the private information. Should the employer be concerned? Probably. So employers just want to make sure that they are establishing policies for telecommuting employees to keep information secure and confidential, training employees on how to treat confidential information, whether that means, you know, employees need to make sure that confidential information is kept separately to shred when they get back to the office, or if they have a shredder at home. Make sure that you're working with your IT professionals, whether they need additional security on their Wi-Fi or certain password protections. All of that is far above my pay grade, but I know that that is things people do. So you can work to kind of make sure you're keeping information private. Performance standards should be the same during telecommuting. So we have John here, who's been telecommuting for about 2 weeks and missed 3 deadlines. What can his employer do? As I mentioned, telecommuting employees should be held to the same standards as non-telecommuting employees. So if John missed deadlines, he still needs to comply with them and should be disciplined as any other employee would during any other time. It's important to set clear performance expectations for all employees at all times generally, but I think especially now so employees understand what is expected of them. We have some workers' comp issues. I'm gonna breeze through these, just flip through them. You can read them when you get the slides for the interest of time. Just with workers' comp, you wanna make sure that you're very clear on job descriptions. I think is really important to make sure that you know what is part of the job. So if an employee gets hurt at home, you know whether that was, you can easily show whether that was part of the job, and make sure that if you do have a telecommuting, that it says that the employee will work in a safe environment, and the employer may come in to inspect the environment. Moving on to pay practices, I think pay practices are the biggest potential liability for employers with telecommuting, because wage and hour lawsuits are so expensive. An employee can get the money that they were not paid, as well as double damages and attorney's fees. So, you know, if you owe an employee $200 because you didn't pay for time worked, all of a sudden that can become a several $1,000 claim. So it's very important to make sure that employees are keeping track of time and that you're paying employees properly, just as you would if they were in the office. So we have Caroline, who's a non-exempt employee working from home. She's been working overtime without permission, even though her employer has a policy that employees cannot work overtime without written supervisor permission. So Caroline can be disciplined for violating this policy because she was not allowed to work overtime without permission, but the employer must still pay Caroline for her hours, even though they are worked without permission. So she could have a potential wage claim if the employer says, well, you didn't get permission, so we're not paying that. So you want to make sure that you're paying employees for all time worked and overtime as applicable. So now Caroline's employer gave her a written warning for working overtime without permission, and she feels bad about costing her employer extra money, so she decides not to log all her hours, and her supervisor notices that the timesheet doesn't match the times supervisor knows she worked. Again, the employer needs to pay for all hours that the employer knows Caroline worked. I mean, the employer doesn't need to, you know, go digging and try to figure everything out. But if, you know, the supervisor knows she was on a conference call, or knows she was in a meeting or doing emails or whatever else, the employee, Caroline, should be paid for the time the employer knows was worked. Caroline should also be disciplined for not logging all of her hours worked. And I think that's really important, because if an employee brings a wage claim, we want to show, like, look, we were trying to get employees to stay their time worked. They were disciplined for not logging the hours worked, and show that we were doing our part. So off the clock work, I think, can become an issue when employers are working and not logging the time. So we have an employee who is working 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. generally, and the supervisor texts one evening at 7:15 p.m., so after the work hours, asking if Jennifer had emailed out documents for a meeting the next morning. Does Jennifer have to respond? Does she have to pay for the time responding? The Fair Labor Standards Act, which governs federal wage law, says that you can discard some time, which is called de minimis time. Here we have the factors: amount of time worked daily, administrative difficulty of recording the time, the size of the claim, so how much time it would be in total, and how regularly that happens. So here, you know, if she's responding to one text message later in the evening, that's probably considered de minimis because it's just a one-off thing. It would be a pain to put 30 seconds, however long it takes her to respond on the timesheet. So she probably doesn't need to be paid for that, but the employer should be training supervisors not to text employees about work matters after hours. So what if that's happening 2 to 3 times per week? That's starting to look like it happens regularly and could be an issue. So employers should not be communicating with non-exempt employees outside of working hours. Now we have Allison, who's a non-exempt employee, regularly checking her email. She said she doesn't respond, but she likes to keep track of what is coming in. Should she be paid for her time tracking her emails? Probably, if she's doing it regularly and long enough, even though she's not responding, it still is requiring effort, and she's probably thinking about it and thinking about a response for the next day. So I think that non-exempt employees should not have access to work email on personal devices and accessing work email outside of work. I know that that is a very conservative approach, and that sometimes that's not practical depending on the job duties, if you have employees on call or need to be reached. But I generally, for most non-exempt employees, I don't think they should have work email on the personal device. I think the risk of an employee bringing a wage claim and saying, hey, I respond to emails after work hours is too high, and they're so expensive. So I think and to be most conservative, I think it's good for employers to say non-exempt employees should not be accessing work email outside of work hours. And again, employers want to make sure that they have a policy requiring non-exempt employees to log all work time, that you're paying for that accordingly. So that was a fly through of different policies to think about. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer to talk about communicating these things.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate that. And I don't think that I have control of slides, so if you could just switch, thank you very much. I'm just going to touch base on communication with your team, with your employees, and kind of some human resources best practices as we make this transition. So your employees that are returning to work during and after COVID, I think we all realize isn't as simple as announcing that the doors are open and that business is usual. Many businesses and workplaces will be altered in the way they conduct their business, and some changes will be short-term, some of them will be long-term. I think we've all heard that we're looking well into 2021 before we possibly have a vaccine, and we're looking to have 60 to 70% of the population that has been exposed to have what they call herd immunity. So some of the policies that Emily has discussed to be put into place may just become norm. They may not go away after a few months or at the end of the year. So give some thought to what that means to your business, to your job descriptions, hiring, etc. So I think it's important to establish a clear communication plan that will allow your employees and customers to understand how the business plans to reopen, how to be safe, and reestablish business processes. Transparency and a common understanding of the new procedures and systems in place will help keep your employees and customers feeling safe. And build communication strategies that are welcoming to your returning employees. To me, that means frequent communication, give periodic updates, letting your employees know that you are staying on top of things and up to date on developments. When there's changes in some of the governor's orders about physical distancing, number of employees and or customers allowed in the workspace, communicate with your employees about how this will affect their work and what new policies and procedures may need to be implemented to keep them safe. If you think about it, lack of information can make some employees feel that their employer is trying to hide something or isn't taking this seriously. So from my standpoint, communication is going to be your best tool during this time and beyond. Provide information on what COVID-19 is. I know that we're inundated with information. Some of it's true, some of it's not, but knowledge is power, and employees may be feeling somewhat powerless at this time. So use information from the CDC, from the World Health Organization, and your local authorities such as San Juan Basin Health to explain what the virus is, how it spreads, how you break the chain of transmission, and who is at risk and who is not. Another, I think, important piece during this time of transitioning, bringing your employees and customers back, is to listen. When possible, schedule intentional time to talk to employees in small groups, less than 10, with social distancing in place, and listen to what your employees have been experiencing during this time. Ask questions. What are their concerns? What are their worries? Give them several channels to voice their concerns, whether that's to their management, to their human resources department, a safety committee, or other appropriate channel. Consider offering a channel for anonymous concerns to be submitted for those afraid to speak up. And when possible, follow up individually and continue your company-wide updates as appropriate and necessary. Make sure that you're listening openly and not being defensive if an employee comes to you with a question or concern about policies that are in place or concerned about coming back to work and what that might mean for them. Some employees just need to feel heard and they don't need to be kind of stonewalled or pushed back on their heels with company policy language. Take some time to explain it, restate it back to them in simpler terms if possible, to show that you understand and you're empathizing with the situation that they're currently in. Again, I think, as I stated in the beginning, communication is really going to be key during this process and will probably help eliminate a lot of confusion and fear if you're open and transparent. And if Emily, if you'll, thank you. And so best practices, you likely don't have all the answers. As Emily stated at the beginning of the presentation, things are constantly changing about the orders and what we should and should not be doing, how slowly we're opening. We hear that some states open sooner and faster than others. So acknowledge that you don't have all the answers. Be open and honest with your team to help them transition back to the workplace so that things are smoothly and to help avoid employee concerns and complaints. You can switch to the next slide, Emily. Some items around best practices. Can ensure that your employees, that their health and safety is your #1 priority. That's why you're putting these policies and procedures in place. You want to make sure that they're safe and that they feel as if you care about them. Review new policies and procedures in small groups if possible or one-on-one so employees understand what is expected of them and what they can expect of you. I would provide a written copy of all the new policies and procedures to employees. Set aside time to review them with your employees to address and answer any questions or concerns that may arise after they've reviewed. Give employees time to kind of digest and review, and then ask them to sign a document that acknowledges that they've reviewed and understand the new policies that are in place. If you have the opportunity, I would highly recommend doing an onboarding as you're bringing your employees back or putting these new policies and procedures into place. Walk through the policy changes that have a direct effect on individual employees or teams. Wearing and changing out gloves, hand washing breaks and sanitizing breaks, staggering breaks to reduce the number of employees in the break room at the same time. Kind of walk through what this will look like for those employees and how they can expect these changes to impact their day. Show employees where they can find their PPE equipment, extra hand sanitizer, disinfecting wipes, and remember that things aren't the same. So it's important to take time to teach and listen to your employees and answer questions. Post signs where and when necessary, as Emily had said, in break rooms. If people are sharing putting food in a refrigerator or using the coffee pot, make sure that you have hand sanitizing wipes there to keep areas clean and disinfected. If, again, it's not business as usual, people have all experienced this at different levels. So take time to connect with your employees when they return, check in with them, make sure that they're doing okay. Do they need something more? I have a friend who has an employee that is hesitant to come back and open the doors. So they're making an accommodation for her that for 2 weeks on her shift, she can keep the door closed because that makes her feel a little bit safer. But they put a deadline on that, a timeline around that, saying for 2 weeks, we'll do this and we'll revisit it. But eventually we have to have our doors open all the time to accommodate our customers. So setting your clear expectation for your employees returning to the workplace and for those that continue to telecommute as well. And I think Emily did a great job on the telecommuting. And yes, I think that could be a whole presentation of itself because there's so many ins and outs around that. When your employees are returning to the workplace or those that continue to work from home, let them know what you expect from them and what they can expect from you and your managers or their managers. Schedule your regular check-ins, define their performance goals and expectations. And if an employee is due to have a quarterly or mid-year or annual review, I would recommend keeping that on the schedule. Granted, things have changed. Perhaps they've been off work for the last 6 to 8 weeks, but that allows you another opportunity to connect with your employee and to revisit goals and expectations and to make necessary modifications looking out for the next month or 2 months or until the end of the year. I think you'll see a theme here that this is all about communication and connecting with your employees, because this is really a very scary time for people. And they want to know that they're heard. They want to know that their employer cares about them. Remind employees about available benefits that they may have. Many employers have employee assistant programs that usually offer a free counseling session over the phone. They're confidential sessions that could be useful for some employees during this time to help understand and reduce anxiety over the virus. Most group health plans now must cover COVID-19 related testing without passing on any of the costs to the employees, which could help relieve some financial worries. If you must lay off or furlough employees, notify them of their right to unemployment compensation and the expanded eligibility requirements afforded to them under the CARES Act. Be vigilant in your cleaning procedures. Again, Emily went over the policies around that. Communicate those to your workers, practice social distancing in and around your business, and provide PPE where possible to help reduce employee stress about contamination. Make sure that you're modeling that with your employees as well. That's very important. Insist employees who have symptoms of infection self-isolate and stay at home. And that goes back to Emily talking about needing to take temperatures as employees return to work. Be generous where possible. Not every employee request can be honored, but relaxing some of your normal practices and policies may do a lot to ease nerves. If an employee wants to wear a mask at work, even though it maybe won't stop the virus from passing through, let them wear it if possible. If that makes them feel safe and secure, they're happier to show up to work and give their best. If an employee wants to telecommute and that can be done successfully, let them do so on a temporary basis. Have a conversation what that expectation looks like, that we'll try it for the short term, and then revisit at the end of 2-3 weeks or whatever that looks like for you and your employee. As an employer, your willingness to help employees cope can go a long way to reduce stress and to keep them engaged and giving you their best to help you and your business. And then lastly, I would just recommend being creative during this time. Consider flexible scheduling, alternative work weeks, staggering shifts, or rotating telecommuting, especially for those, not especially, but as we know, kids are not going back to school for the rest of the year, and there won't be any school or summer programs for kids, and that causes a lot of stress for a lot of parents because they've been homeschooling for the last 8 or 9 weeks, I believe it's been, and now they need to think about what they're going to do to keep their kids engaged and safe during the summer. They don't have camps and programs to send them to. So ways that you can help accommodate that. Fewer people in your workplace helps lessen exposure. And again, that helps your employees feel safe, feel cared for, and they want to continue showing up and want to work for you and stay engaged working with you. So those are my kind of suggestions, best practices for your employees returning to work. And I think now we can go ahead and open it to any questions that may be out there.
Yeah, and well, I was also going to add, with all of those steps that Jennifer recommended, which I think are all wonderful options, I think you should be documenting everything you're doing. So if you are, allowing an employee to telework on a temporary basis and it doesn't work out, make sure you document why. So if the employee was having performance issues, or it turns out that the employee's job just doesn't work remotely, that you have documentation of that in case the employee ever comes back and says, it's because I was disabled, or, because of my gender, you didn't let me do this. Or if you have a workers' comp claim about coronavirus, that you can say, we took these steps. Documentation doesn't have to be fancy, just even an email to yourself of like, hey, I reminded Joe to use hand sanitizer today, or to clean up the desk, anything like that. In our job, we always joke, no one calls us with good news. So, people call us when things have gone really wrong, unfortunately. So just trying to think about how to put yourself in the best position should the worst case scenario happen, and documentation goes a long way so you can show what happened, what steps you were taking, because if this comes up in a year, you might not remember what you did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any policies you put in place, make sure that they're in writing as well and well articulated to your teams.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you both for presenting this morning. We're so lucky to have you guys tune in and support the small businesses in our area. So we do have a couple questions. I'm going to answer one real quick. I should have mentioned this earlier, but yes, we recorded this webinar, and I will be sending out the link and the slide deck after the presentation. Perfect. So let's go ahead and dive in. Are all employers required to keep a log for employees' temperatures, or is that just for employers with over 50 employees?
That's a good question. The public health order is not clear about that. The part of the public health order that talks about the log is part of the public health order that applies to all employers, but then it does later specifically says that employers over 50 have to implement those workplace monitoring stations. So maybe, yeah, unfortunately, there's no clear answer to that because the public health order is not clear. I think it's not a bad idea to comply with that, but I also know that it's easy for me to say that, and I'm not the one actually arranging, employees to have their temperature checked. So, yeah, unfortunately, there's been no clear guidance over whether that applies to all employers. Certainly, yeah, if you have more than 50 employees in any work location, it definitely applies. If you have less than that, probably applies, but it has not been clear from the Colorado.
Can I jump in and ask kind of a follow-up question on that? Because
Sure.
There are a number of points of policy that are guidelines and recommendations and are not required by law.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens, we have a responsibility to our employees
Sure.
as we go back into business. So what does that look like as far as, say I own a store and it's not required for me to make masks mandatory of my customers, and I certainly don't want to drive any customers away, but what's my liability if one of my employees is exposed to coronavirus because I chose not to go to that kind of higher level of tracking? Sure. Or, implementing policy?
Yeah, great question. OSHA, the two kind of big areas of liability would be workers' comp and OSHA coming out, I guess also general negligence or something. OSHA specifically said that it won't be enforcing coronavirus cases unless it seems very extreme. Workers' comp also said employers will not have liability unless it's very obvious that the employee got coronavirus in the workplace, which would be very difficult for the employee to show. It couldn't happen, sure, if an employee, lives by him or herself, only goes to work, orders groceries, and, takes all these steps. I suppose an employer could have liability if then the employee shows, I 100% got it at work, but that's just so hard to show, especially without tracing and all these, and testing and everything going on right now. So I'm not particularly concerned about employer liability for not taking those steps, unless it's required by law, of course. You want to comply with the law. I think it's not a bad idea, especially for some things that are pretty, put hand sanitizer at your entrance, for example. Things like that would be fairly simple to implement, I think are, again, not a bad idea in case it ever became an issue. In worst case scenario, you could say like, hey, I took these steps, but I am not overly concerned about liability for someone getting coronavirus, because again, it's so hard to show where you got it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. Do you have sample policy language to share that we might use as the basis for policy changes to our employee handbook?
I don't know if Jennifer does. We have a sample about quarantining for employees who are leaving. The so far social distancing policies, because this is so new, has been kind of one-off things for different employers, and we haven't put together yet a template for employers, unfortunately.
I have some policies about telecommuting. and some policies kind of around flexible scheduling, what that could look like, or staggering shifts and things like that. And I can easily put together other sample policies if there's something more specific that people are looking for.
Perfect. And I will say too, Jennifer is actually one of our consultants on the SBDC team. So if you want to follow up with Jennifer about any of those policy updates, feel free to email me and I can set up an appointment for you too. And I'm guessing that Emily would be happy to speak with you guys too. So we'll send out their contact information after if you have any follow-up questions. Okay, moving on. Is it incumbent on the employer or vulnerable employee to initiate the conversation about reporting back to work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Unclear. And the Department of Public Health, the public health order doesn't specify whether it's on the employee who has to say, hey, I'm a vulnerable individual because I'm over 65, I'm pregnant, whatever reason. Right now, we've kind of been recommending leaving it to employees to take that initiative, particularly because some of the conditions to make someone a vulnerable individual are not apparent. If someone has, an autoimmune disease that makes them a vulnerable individual, we don't want to start playing doctor with employees. So we don't want to say, hey, all employees, let us know if you're immunocompromised or anything like that. I think it's a good idea, like Jennifer talked about, communicating and making sure employees understand the requirements and what the executive order says so that they have those abilities. If you know an employee is pregnant, know an employee is over 65, I think those are the most likely things an employer would know. Yeah, you could reach out. I don't think that is a bad idea, but I don't think that the employer necessarily has a duty to do that, at least not under the executive order or the public health order. Again, there's no clear guidance on that. Okay.
And can an employer require any kind of verification of that? If an employee says, I have a special condition, I can't, do you just have to take them at their word? Is that the best policy?
You can ask for a doctor's note for that. So you can get a doctor's note. As far as timing, there's no, the ADA doesn't set forth a required amount of time you have to allow an employee to provide documentation. It should be reasonable. So if you say the next day, that, is not reasonable. A week, 2 weeks, I think is fair. The CDC, in the context of doctor's notes to come back to work, has recommended that employers not get doctor's notes because of the burden on the healthcare system. Employers still can get doctor's notes. I think, in our area, we're not, at least to my knowledge, seeing kind of the burden on the healthcare system that we're seeing in, New York and some of the other hotspots. So asking for a doctor's note, I don't see, there's no legal problem with that, so to speak.
Okay, and then another part of that question, if vulnerable employees are not reporting to work and telecommuting options are not available for their position, what are the requirements on the employer for salary and/or position maintenance during that period?
Yeah, so that's going to depend on if any of those leaves apply. If the employer has, if the employee has not used leave under the FFCRA and that applies to the employee might have to receive 2 weeks of job protected or of paid leave because they're in quarantine under an executive order. But generally, there's no job protection requirement under these laws. If it's FMLA leave, there's job protection, and if it's leave for caring for a child, that can be job protected, again, depending on the circumstances. But as generally, no, there's no requirement to protect the job. The law doesn't even say that you can't terminate a vulnerable individual, which seems kind of extreme, and then could potentially run into discrimination issues. So it's not my recommendation that that's your first step to terminate a vulnerable individual who can't come to work. You could just work through what that different options for and how long it could last. But there's no necessary job protection other than, of course, don't discriminate against those employees.
I think this is where maybe an employer can try to be creative with their employees is there work that can be done that maybe isn't necessarily part of their job, but is there inventory that could be taken or something like that, like, you know, cleaning out a storage space, something that gets the employee back into the workspace, but maybe they're a little bit isolated, but they're still contributing, they're still, you know, showing up and working, and then see if that helps to transition them back into their current position. But again, with what Emily said, you know, the employer can also say, well, then I need to hire somebody to fill this position because I need this job done, and I can't guarantee that the position will still be available to you when you are ready to come back to work or feel safe coming back to work, or whatever that is that's prohibiting the employee.
Perfect, thank you. One last question. Any idea where we can get a no-touch thermometer?
I don't know.
Maybe Amazon?
Amazon's where I order everything.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure
I would look on Amazon. I know that there are some local economic development groups that are looking to buy them in bulk. So be looking for those. So check with the chambers, check with the economic development groups. I know that Southwest CODA, so southwestcoda.org, which is the task force, we're working on some bulk purchases. And then a really creative solution that I heard from another county was ask your employees if anybody has one, or if they want to, you know, maybe each employee has their own. So it may be that you can ask employees to bring thermometers from home, and you can kind of do it that way too.
And we just had, someone wrote in the chat that Walmart has them for about $80.
Perfect.
So there's a local option.
It looks like maybe that's an online option.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I think that wraps up all of the questions we have. If you guys think of anything after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be happy to assist you along the way. We are planning on having another 2 more webinars relating to HR, so stay tuned for those as we put those together. And then again, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific topics that you're wanting to learn more about. I'd be happy to put something together for that as well. I think that's all I have. Mary, do you want to say anything?
I just want to say thank you again to Jennifer and to Emily for joining us today. We really value the information that you shared with us today. Again, I would highly recommend any business that has questions, reach out to Hannah or to myself. Even if it's not HR related, we have a whole team of consultants. We are here to help. We can do it in a one-on-one Zoom format or telephone call. So don't hesitate to reach out to SBDC if you need any assistance at all.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys, and I will send you guys a follow-up email shortly with the slide deck and the webinar. So thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.